He froze at his reflection in the mirror, because the man in the glass wasn't smiling back.
Part 35 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 35. The Countess of Bristol, otherwise the Duchess of Kingston, convicted of bigamy. Part 2. Her spirits being soothed by the interview, the Duchess embarked for Dover, landed, drove to Kingston House, and found friends displaying both zeal and alacrity in her cause. The first measure taken was to have the Duchess bailed. This was done before Lord Mansfield, the Duke of Newcastle, Lord Mountstuart, Mr. Glover, and other characters of rank attending. The prosecution and consequent trial of the Duchess becoming objects of magnitude, the public curiosity and expectation were proportionably excited. The Duchess had through life distinguished herself as a most eccentric character. Her turn of mind was original, and many of her actions were without a parallel. Even when she moved in the sphere of amusement, it was in a style peculiarly her own. If others invited admiration by a partial display of their charms at a masquerade, she at once threw off the veil and set censure at defiance. Thus at midnight assemblies, where Bacchus revelled, and the altars of Venus were encircled by the votaries of love, the Duchess, then Miss Chudleigh, appeared almost in the unadorned simplicity of primitive nature. The dilemma, therefore, into which she was thrown by the pending prosecution was, to such a character, of the most perplexing kind. She had already in a manner invited the disgrace, and she now neglected the means of preventing it. Mrs. Cradock, the only existing evidence against her, again personally solicited a maintenance for the remaining years of her life, and voluntarily offered, in case a stipend should be settled on her, to retire to her native village and never more intrude. The offer was rejected by the Duchess, who would only consent to allow her £20 a year, on condition of her sequestering herself in some place near the Peak of Derbyshire. This the Duchess considered as a most liberal offer, and she expressed her astonishment that it should be rejected. Under the assurances of her lawyers, the Duchess was as quiet as that troublesome monitor her own heart would permit her to be, and reconciled in some measure to the encounter with which she was about to meet, her repose was most painfully disturbed by an adversary, who appeared in a new and most unexpected quarter. This was the celebrated Foote, the actor, who, having mixed in the first circles of fashion, was perfectly acquainted with the leading transactions of the Duchess's life, and had resolved to turn his knowledge to his own advantage. As in the opinion of Mandeville, private vices are public benefits, so Foote deemed the crimes and vices of individuals lawful game for his wit. On this principle he proceeded with the Duchess of Kingston, and he wrote a piece founded on her life called The Trip to Calais. The scenes were humorous, the character of the Duchess admirably drawn, and the effect of the performance of the farce on the stage would have been that which was most congenial to the tastes of the scandal-mongers of the day, namely, to make the Duchess ashamed of herself. The real object of Mr. Foote, however, was one of a nature more likely to prove advantageous to himself. It was to obtain money to secure the suppression of the piece, and with this view he contrived to have it communicated to her Grace that the Haymarket Theatre would open with an entertainment in which she was taken off to the life. Alarmed at this, she sent for Foote, who attended with the piece in his pocket, but having been desired to read it, he had not gone far before the character of Lady Kitty Crocodile being introduced, the Duchess could no longer control her anger, and rising in a violent rage, she exclaimed, "Why, this is scandalous! What a wretch you have made me!" Mr. Foote assured her that the character was not intended to caricature her, even in his serious moments being unable to control his desire to pun, for he left her to infer that it was a true picture, and the Duchess, having taken a few turns about the room, became more composed, and requested that the piece might be left for her perusal, engaging that it should be returned by the ensuing evening. The actor readily complied and retired, but the lady, being left to consider her own portrait, was so displeased with the likeness that she determined, if possible, to prevent its exposure on the stage. The artist had no objection to sell his work, and she was inclined to become the purchaser, but on the former being questioned as to the sum which he should expect for suppressing the piece, he proportioned his expectations to what he deemed the Duchess's power of gratifying them, and demanded 2,000 guineas, besides a sum to be paid as compensation for the loss of the scenes which had been painted for the farce, and which were not applicable to any other purpose. The magnitude of the demand, as well it might, staggered the Duchess, and having intimated her extreme astonishment at so exorbitant a proposition, she expressed a wish that the sum might be fixed at one within the bounds of moderation and reason. The actor was positive, concluding that, as his was the only article in the market, he might name his own price, but the result was that, by demanding too much, he lost all. A cheque for £1,400 was offered. The amount was increased to £1,600, and a draft on Messrs. Drummond's was actually signed, but the obstinacy of the actor was so great that he refused to abate 1 guinea from his original demand. The circumstance might at any other time have passed among the indifferent events of the day, and as wholly undeserving of the public notice, but those long connected with the Duchess, and in habits of intimacy, felt the attack made on her as directed by a ruffian hand, at a moment when she was least able to make resistance. His Grace the Duke of Newcastle was consulted. The Chamberlain of the household, the Earl of Hertford, was apprised of the circumstance, and his prohibitory interference was earnestly solicited. He sent for the manuscript copy of the Trip to Calais, perused and censured it. But besides these and other powerful aids, the Duchess called in professional advice. The sages of the robe were consulted, and their opinions were that the piece was a malicious libel, and that, should it be represented, a shorthand writer ought to be employed to attend on the night of representation, to minute each offensive passage as the groundwork of a prosecution. This advice was followed, and Foote was intimidated. He denied having made a demand of 2,000 guineas, but the Reverend Mr. Foster contradicted him in an affidavit. Thus defeated in point of fact, Foote found himself baffled also in point of design. The Chamberlain would not permit the piece to be represented. Foote now had recourse to another expedient. He caused it to be intimated that it was in his power to publish if not to perform, but were his expenses reimbursed, and the sum which her Grace had formerly offered would do the business, he would desist. This being communicated to the Duchess, she in this, as in too many cases, asked the opinion of her friends, with a secret determination to follow her own. Foote, finding that she began to yield, pressed his desire incessantly, and she had actually provided bills to the amount of £1,600, which she would have given him but for the Reverend Mr. Jackson, who, being asked his opinion of the demand, returned the answer, "Instead of complying with it, your Grace should obtain complete evidence of the menace and demand, and then consult your counsel whether a prosecution will not lie for endeavouring to extort money by threats. Your Grace must remember the attack on the first Duke of Marlborough by a stranger, who had formed a design either on his purse or his interest, and endeavoured to menace him into a compliance." This answer struck the Earl of Peterborough and Mr. Foster very forcibly, as in perfect coincidence with their own opinions, and Mr. Jackson was then solicited to wait on Mr. Foote. Mr. Foster, the chaplain of the Duchess, professing himself to be too far advanced in years to enter into the field of literary combat. Mr. Jackson consented to be the champion on the following condition: that the Duchess would give her honour never to retract her determination, nor to let Foote extort from her a single guinea. Her Grace subscribing to this condition, Mr. Jackson waited on Mr. Foote at his house in Suffolk Street, and intimated to him the resolution to which the Duchess had come. The actor, however, still wished to have matters compromised, and to this end he addressed a letter to the Duchess, which began with stating that a member of the Privy Council and a friend of her Grace, by whom he meant the Duke of Newcastle, had conversed with him on the subject of the dispute between them, and that for himself he was ready to have everything adjusted. This letter afforded the Duchess a triumph. Every line contained a concession, and, contrary to the advice of her friends, she insisted upon the publication of the whole correspondence. This circumstance for a time served to turn the current of attention into a new channel. But while the public notice was withdrawn from her Grace, she felt too heavily the necessity which existed to adopt some course to enable her either to evade or meet the impending danger. Her line of procedure was soon determined upon. She affected an earnest desire to have the trial, if possible, accelerated, while in secret she took every means in her power to evade the measures which her opponents had taken against her. Her conduct in other respects appears to have been strangely inconsistent. An opportunity presented itself which remained only to be embraced to secure her object. It became the subject of a discussion in the House of Lords, whether the trial of her Grace should not be conducted in Westminster Hall, and the expense which would necessarily be incurred by the country was by many urged as being a burden which ought not to rest upon the public purse. Lord Mansfield, privately desiring to save the Duchess from the disgrace and ignominy of a public trial, strove to avail himself of this objection in her favour, and so great had become the differences of opinion entertained upon the subject, that the withdrawal of the prosecution altogether would have been a matter which would have been considered desirable rather than improper. Here then was the critical moment at which the Duchess might have determined her future fate. A hint was privately conveyed to her that the sum of £10,000 would satisfy every expectation, and put an end to the prosecution; and doubts being expressed of the sincerity of the proposal, the offer was made in distinct terms. The Duchess was entreated by her friends to accept the proposition which was made, and so at once to relieve herself and them from all fear of the consequences which might result to her, but through a fatal mistaken confidence either in the legal construction of her case or in her own machinations, she refused to accede to the offers which were held out. Resting assured of her acquittal, she resisted every attempt at dissuasion from her purpose of going to trial, and she assumed an air of indifference about the business which but ill accorded with the doubtful nature of her position. She talked of the absolute necessity of setting out for Rome, affected to have some material business to settle with the Pope, and in consequence took every means and urged every argument in her power to procure the speedy termination of the proceedings, as if the regular course of justice had not been swift enough to overtake her. In the midst of her confidence, however, she did not abandon her manoeuvring, but at the very moment when she was petitioning for a speedy trial, she was engaged in a scheme to get rid of the principal witness against her. Mrs. Craddock, to whom before she had refused a trifling remuneration, might now have demanded thousands as the price of her evidence. A negotiation was carried on through the medium of a relation of hers, who was a letter carrier, which had for its object her removal from England, and an interview was arranged to take place between her and the Duchess, at which the latter was to appear disguised, and was to reveal herself only after some conversation, the object of which was that terms might be proposed, but her Grace was duped, for having changed her clothes to those of a man, she waited at the appointed hour and place without seeing either Mrs. Cradock or the person who had promised to effect the meeting, and she afterwards learned that every particular of this business had been communicated to the prosecutors, who instructed the letter carrier to pretend an acquiescence in the scheme. Thus baffled in a project which had a plausible appearance of success, the only method left was the best possible arrangement of matters preparatory to the trial. On the 15th day of April 1766 the business came on in Westminster Hall, when the Queen was present, accompanied by the Prince of Wales, Princess Royal, and others of the royal family. Many foreign ambassadors also attended, as well as several of the nobility. These having taken their seats, the Duchess came forward, attended by Mrs. Egerton, Mrs. Barrington, and Miss Chudleigh, three of the ladies of her bedchamber, and her chaplain, physician, and apothecary, and as she approached the bar she made 3 reverences, and then dropped on her knees, when the Lord High Steward said, "Madam, you may rise." Having risen, she courtesied to the Lord High Steward and the House of Peers, and her compliments were returned. Proclamation being made for silence, the Lord High Steward mentioned to the prisoner the fatal consequences attending the crime of which she stood indicted, signifying that, however alarming and awful her present circumstances, she might derive great consolation from considering that she was to be tried by the most liberal, candid, and august assembly in the universe. The Duchess then read a paper, setting forth that she was guiltless of the offence alleged against her, and that the agitation of her mind arose, not from the consciousness of guilt, but from the painful circumstance of being called before so awful a tribunal on a criminal accusation. She begged, therefore, that if she was deficient in the observance of any ceremonial points, her failure might not be understood as proceeding from wilful disrespect, but should be attributed to the unfortunate peculiarity of her situation. It was added that she had travelled from Rome in so dangerous a state of health that it was necessary for her to be conveyed in a litter, and that she was perfectly satisfied that she should have a fair trial, since the determination respecting her cause, on which materially depended her honour and fortune, would proceed from the most unprejudiced and august assembly in the world. The Lord High Steward then desired the lady to give attention while she was arraigned on an indictment for bigamy, and proclamation for silence having been again made, the Duchess, who had been permitted to sit, arose and read a paper, representing to the court that she was advised by her counsel to plead the sentence of the Ecclesiastical Court in the year 1769 as a bar to her being tried on the present indictment. The Lord High Steward informed her that she must plead to the indictment, in consequence of which she was arraigned, and being asked by the Clerk of the Crown whether she was guilty of the felony with which she stood charged, she answered with great firmness, "Not guilty, my lords." The Clerk of the Crown then asking her how she should be tried, she said, "By God and my peers," on which the clerk said, "God send your ladyship a good deliverance." 4 days were occupied in arguments of counsel respecting the admission or rejection of a sentence of the spiritual court, but the peers having decided that it could not be admitted, the trial proceeded. The first witness examined was Anne Cradock, whose testimony was as follows: "I have known her Grace the Duchess of Kingston ever since the year 1742, at which time she came on a visit to the house of Mr. Merrill at Lainston in Hampshire during the Winchester races. At that time I lived in the service of Mrs. Hanmer, Miss Chudleigh's aunt, who was then on a visit at Mr. Merrill's, where Mr. Hervey and Miss Chudleigh first met, and soon conceived a mutual attachment for each other. They were privately married one evening at about 11 o'clock in Lainston Church, in the presence of Mr. Mountney, Mrs. Hanmer, the Reverend Mr. Ames, the rector, who performed the ceremony, and myself. I was ordered out of the church to entice Mr. Merrill's servants out of the way. I saw the bride and bridegroom put to bed together, and Mrs. Hanmer obliged them to rise again. They went to bed together the following night. In a few days Mr. Hervey was under the necessity of going to Portsmouth in order to join Sir John Danvers' fleet, in which he was then a lieutenant, and being ordered to call him at 5 o'clock in the morning, I went into the bedchamber at the appointed hour, and found him and his lady sleeping in bed together. I was unwilling to disturb them, as I thought that the delay of an hour or two would make no difference, but they afterwards parted. My husband, to whom I was not then married, accompanied Mr. Hervey in the capacity of a servant. When Mr. Hervey returned from the Mediterranean, he and his lady lived together, and I then thought that she was pregnant. Some months after, Mr. Hervey went again to sea, and during his absence I was informed that the lady was brought to bed, and I was afterwards confirmed in the information by the lady herself, who said that she had a little boy at nurse, whose features greatly resembled those of Mr. Hervey. In answer to questions put by the Duke of Grafton, the witness said that she had never seen the child, that it was dark when the marriage took place in the church, and that Mr. Mountney carried a wax light attached to the crown of his hat. Upon being asked by the Earl of Hillsborough whether she had not received a letter containing some offer to induce her to appear now as a witness, she admitted that Mr. Fossard of Piccadilly had written to her, offering her a sinecure place on condition of her coming forward to give evidence against her Grace, and stating that she might, if she pleased, exhibit the letter to the Earl of Bristol. The cross-examination of the witness on this point was continued during the remainder of the sitting of the Lordships, and on the following day, the 20th of April, it was resumed, the Earls of Derby, Hillsborough, and Buckinghamshire questioning her with considerable acumen. She at length confessed that pecuniary offers had been made to her to induce her to appear, and that she had acceded to the terms proposed. Mrs. Sophia Pettiplace was examined as to the facts deposed by Mrs. Craddock, but she was able to afford no positive information upon the subject. She lived with her Grace at the time of the supposed marriage, but was not present at the ceremony, and only believed that the Duchess had mentioned the circumstance to her. Caesar Hawkins, Esquire, deposed that he had been acquainted with the Duchess several years, he believed not less than 30. He had heard of a marriage between Mr. Hervey and the lady at the bar, which circumstance was afterwards mentioned to him by both parties, previous to Mr. Hervey's last going to sea. By the desire of her Grace, he was in the room when the issue of the marriage was born, and once saw the child. He was sent for by Mr. Hervey soon after his return from sea, and desired by him to wait upon the lady, with proposals for procuring a divorce, which he accordingly did, when her Grace declared herself absolutely determined against listening to such terms, and he knew that many messages passed on the subject. Her Grace some time after informed him, at his own house, that she had instituted a jactitation suit against Mr. Hervey in Doctors' Commons. On another visit she appeared very grave, and desiring him to retire into another apartment, said she was exceedingly unhappy, in consequence of an oath which she had long dreaded, having been tendered to her at Doctors' Commons to disavow her marriage, which she would not do for 10,000 worlds. Upon another visit, a short time after, she informed him that a sentence had passed in her favour at Doctors' Commons, which would be irrevocable unless Mr. Hervey pursued certain measures within a limited time, which she did not apprehend he would do. Hereupon he enquired how she got over the oath, and her reply was, that the circumstance of her marriage was so blended with falsities that she could easily reconcile the matter to her conscience, since the ceremony was a business of so scrambling and shabby a nature that she could as safely swear she was not as that she was married. Judith Phillips, being called, swore that she was the widow of the Reverend Mr. Ames. that she remembered when her late husband performed the marriage ceremony between Mr. Hervey and the prisoner, that she was not present, but derived her information from her husband, that some time after the marriage the lady desired her to prevail upon her husband to grant a certificate, which she said she believed her husband would not refuse, that Mr. Merrill, who accompanied the lady, advised her to consult his attorney from Worcester, that in compliance with the attorney's advice a register book was purchased, and the marriage inserted therein, with some late burials in the parish. The book was here produced, and the witness swore to the writing of her late husband. The writing of the Reverend Mr. Ames was also proved by the Reverend Mr. Inchin and the Reverend Mr. Dennis, and the entry of a caveat to the Duke's will was proved by a clerk from Doctors' Commons. The book in which the marriage of the Duke of Kingston with the lady at the bar was registered on the 8th of March 1769 was produced by the Reverend Mr. Trebeck of St. Margaret's, Westminster, and the Reverend Mr. Samuel Harper of the British Museum swore that he performed the marriage ceremony between the parties on the day mentioned in the books produced by Mr. Trebeck. Monday the 22nd of April, after the Attorney General had declared the evidence on behalf of the prosecution to be concluded, the Lord High Steward called upon the prisoner for her defence, which she read, and the following are the most material arguments it contained to invalidate the evidence adduced for the prosecutor. She appealed to the Searcher of all hearts that she never considered herself as legally married to Mr. Hervey. She said that she considered herself as a single woman, and as such was addressed by the late Duke of Kingston, and that, influenced by a legitimate attachment to his Grace, she instituted a suit in the ecclesiastical court when her supposed marriage with Mr. Hervey was declared null and void. But, anxious for every conscientious as well as legal sanction, she submitted an authentic statement of her case to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who, in the most decisive and unreserved manner, declared that she was at liberty to marry, and afterwards granted and delivered to Dr. Collier a special licence for her marriage with the late Duke of Kingston. She said that on her marriage she experienced every mark of gracious esteem from their Majesties and her late royal mistress, the Prince Dowager of Wales, and was publicly recognised as Duchess of Kingston. Under such respectable sanctions and virtuous motives for the conduct she pursued, strengthened by a decision that had been esteemed conclusive and irrevocable for the space of 7 centuries, if their lordships should deem her guilty on any rigid principle of law, she hoped, nay, she was conscious, they would attribute her failure as proceeding from a mistaken judgment and erroneous advice, and would not censure her for intentional guilt. She bestowed the highest encomiums on the deceased Duke, and solemnly assured the court that she had in no one instance abused her ascendancy over him, and that, so far from endeavouring to engross his possessions, she had declared herself amply provided for by that fortune for life which he was extremely anxious to bequeath to her in perpetuity. As to the neglect of the Duke's eldest nephew, she said it was entirely the consequence of his disrespectful behaviour to her, and she was not dissatisfied at a preference to another nephew, whose respect and attention to her had been such as the Duke judged to be her due on her advancement to the honour being the wife of his Grace. The Lord High Steward then desired Mr. Wallace to proceed with the evidence on behalf of the Duchess. The advocate stated the nature of the evidence he meant to produce, to prove that Anne Craddock had asserted to different people that she had no recollection of the marriage between Mr. Hervey and the lady at the bar, and that she placed a reliance on a promise of having a provision made for her in consequence of the evidence she was to give on the present trial, and to invalidate the depositions of Judith Phillips, he ordered the clerk to read a letter wherein she supplicated her Grace to exert her influence to prevent her husband's discharge from the Duke's service, and observed that Mrs. Phillips had, on the preceding day, sworn that her husband was not dismissed, but voluntarily quitted his station in the household of his Grace. Mr. Wallace called Mr. Berkeley, Lord Bristol's attorney, who said his lordship told him he was desirous of obtaining a divorce, and directed him to Anne Craddock, saying she was the only person then living who was present at his marriage, and that a short time previous to the commencement of the jactitation suit he waited upon Anne Craddock, who informed him that her memory was bad, and that she could remember nothing perfectly in relation to the marriage, which must have been a long time before. Anne Pritchard deposed that about 3 months before she had been informed by Mrs. Craddock that she expected to be provided for soon after the trial, and that she expected to be enabled to procure a place in the Custom House for one of her relations. This being the whole of the evidence to be produced on behalf of her Grace, the Lord High Steward addressed their lordships, saying that the evidence on both sides having been heard, it now became their lordships' duty to proceed to the consideration of the case, that the importance and solemnity of the occasion required that they should severally pronounce their opinions in the absence of the prisoner at the bar, and that it was for the junior baron to speak first. The prisoner having then been removed, their lordships declared that they found her guilty of the offence imputed to her. Proclamation was then made that the usher of the Black Rod should replace the prisoner at the bar, and immediately on her appearing the Lord High Steward informed her that the Lords had maturely considered the evidence adduced against her, as well as the testimony of the witnesses who had been called on her behalf, and that they had pronounced her guilty of the felony for which she was indicted. He then inquired whether she had anything to say why judgment should not be pronounced against her. The Duchess immediately handed in a paper containing the words, "I plead the privilege of the peerage," which were read by the clerk at the table. The Lord High Steward then informed her Grace that the Lords had considered the plea, and agreed to allow it, adding, "Madam, you will be discharged on paying the usual fees." The Duchess during the trial appeared to be perfectly collected, but on sentence being pronounced, she fainted and was carried out of court. This solemnity was concluded on the 22nd of April, 1776, but the prosecutors still had a plan in embryo to confine the person of the Countess of Bristol, for to this rank she was now again reduced to the kingdom, and to deprive her of her personal property, and a writ of ne exeat regno was actually in the course of preparation, but private notice being conveyed to her of this circumstance, she was advised immediately to quit the country. In order to conceal her flight, she caused her carriage to be driven publicly through the streets, and invited a large party to dine at her house, but, without waiting to apologise to her guests, she drove to Dover in a post-chaise, and there entering a boat with Mr. Harvey, the captain of her yacht, she accompanied him to Calais. Circumstances of which she had been advised, and which had occurred during the period of her absence from Rome, rendered her immediate presence in that city necessary, and proceeding thither without loss of time, she found that a Spanish friar, whom she had left in charge of her palace and furniture, had found means to convert her property into money, and after having seduced a young English girl, who had also been left in the palace, had absconded. Having now obtained the whole of her plate from the public bank where she had deposited it, she returned to Calais, which she adopted as the best place at which she could fix her residence, in consequence of the expeditious communication which existed between that town and London, by means of which she might be afforded the earliest intelligence of the proceedings of her opponents. Their business was now to set aside, if possible, the will of the Duke of Kingston. There was no probability of the success of the attempt, but there was sufficient doubt upon the subject in the mind of the Countess to keep all her apprehensions alive. The will of his Grace of Kingston, however, received every confirmation which the courts of justice could give, and the object of the Countess now was to dissipate rather than expend the income of his estates. A house which she had purchased in Calais was not sufficient for her purpose. A mansion at Montmartre near Paris was fixed on, and the purchase of it was negotiated in as short a time as the Duchess could desire. There were only a few obstacles to enjoyment which were not considered until the purchase was completed. The house was in so ruinous a condition as to be in momentary danger of falling. The land was more like a field of the slothful than the vineyard of the industrious, and these evils were not perceived by the Countess till she was in possession of her wishes. A lawsuit with the owner of the estate was the consequence, and the Countess went to St. Petersburg, and there turned brandy distiller, and returned to Paris before it was concluded. The possession of such a place, however, was not sufficient for the Countess, and she proceeded to make a second purchase of a house, built upon a scale of infinite grandeur. The brother of the existing French king was the owner of a domain, suited in every respect for the residence of a person of such nobility, and the Countess determined to become its mistress. It was called the territory of Saint-Assis, and was situated at a pleasant distance from Paris, abounding in game of all descriptions, and rich in all the luxuriant embellishments of nature. The mansion was of a size which rendered it fit for the occupation of a king. It contained 300 beds. The value of such an estate was too considerable to be expected in one payment. She therefore agreed to discharge the whole of the sum demanded, which was £55,000, by instalments. The purchase on the part of the Countess was a good one. It afforded not only game, but rabbits in plenty, and finding them of superior quality and flavour, her ladyship, during the first week of her possession, had as many killed and sold as brought her 300 guineas. At St. Petersburg she had been a distiller of brandy, and now at Paris she turned rabbit merchant. Such was her situation when, one day, while she was at dinner, her servants received the intelligence that judgment respecting the house near Paris had been awarded against her. The sudden communication of the news produced an agitation of her whole frame. She flew into a violent passion, and burst an internal blood vessel. But she appeared to have surmounted even this, until a few days afterwards, when preparing to rise from her bed, a servant who had long been with her endeavoured to dissuade her from her purpose. The Countess said, "I am not very well, but I will rise," and on a remonstrance being attempted, she said, "At your peril disobey me. I will get up and walk about the room. Ring for the secretary to assist me." She was obeyed, dressed, and the secretary entered the chamber. The Countess then walked about, complained of thirst, and said, "I could drink a glass of my fine Madeira, and eat a slice of toasted bread. I shall be quite well afterwards, but let it be a large glass of wine." The attendant reluctantly brought, and the Countess drank, the wine. She then said, "I am perfectly recovered. I knew the Madeira would do me good. My heart feels oddly. I will have another glass." The servant here observed that such a quantity of wine in the morning might intoxicate rather than benefit. The Countess persisted in her orders, and the second glass of Madeira being produced, she drank that also, and pronounced herself to be charmingly indeed. She then walked a little about the room, and afterwards said, "I will lie down on the couch. I can sleep, and after that I shall be entirely recovered." She seated herself on the couch, a female having hold of each hand. In this situation she soon appeared to have fallen into a sound sleep, until the women felt her hands colder than ordinary, and she was found to have expired. She died August the 26th, 1796. End of part 35. Part 36 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 36. Peter Lemaitre, convicted of robbing the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. When Lord Thurlow was Chancellor of England, some villains broke into his house in Great Ormond Street, and stole the Great Seal of England, which was never recovered, nor were the thieves known. We have heard also of a valuable diamond being stolen from the late Duke of Cumberland, when pressing into the theatre in the Haymarket to see the bubble of the bottle conjurer. It is also a fact that the Duke of Beaufort was robbed of his Diamond Order of St. George as he went to court on a royal birthday, but we have yet to tell that a museum was robbed of its curious medals. Peter Lemaitre, the thief, was a French teacher at Oxford, and being supposed to be a man of industry and good morals, he was indulged with free admission to the Ashmolean Museum. Thither he frequently went, and appeared very studious over the rare books and other valuable articles there deposited. He was frequently left alone to his researches. At one of such times he stole 2 medals, and at another he secreted himself until the doors were locked up for the night. When all had retired, he came from his lurking place and broke open the cabinet where the medals were locked up, and possessed himself of its contents. He then wrenched a bar from the window, and, unsuspected, made his escape. The college was thrown into the utmost consternation on finding their museum thus plundered. Some were suspected, but least of all Lemaitre, until it was discovered that he had privately left the city in a post-chaise and 4, and that he had pledged 2 of the stolen medals to pay the post-boys. This left little doubt that he was the ungrateful thief. He was advertised and described, and by this means apprehended in Ireland. He was conveyed back to Oxford in order to take his trial, and it appeared that 2 of the stolen medals were found in a bureau in his lodgings, of which he had the use, and 2 more were traced to the persons to whom he had sold them. He had little to offer in extenuation of his crime, and on the clearest evidence he was found guilty on the 7th of March, 1777, and he paid the penalty of his offence by enduring 5 years' hard labour at ballast heaving on the River Thames. Whether the ungrateful depredation of Lemaitre stimulated others to the commission of similar crimes we know not, but it is certain that soon afterwards Magdalen College Chapel, Oxford, was broken open by 2 thieves, who stole from the altar a pair of large silver candlesticks and a silver dish, with which they escaped undetected. David Brown Dignam, convicted of pretending to sell places under government. The case of this offender may well be looked upon as a warning to many of those whose advertisements are daily seen in the newspapers of the present day, offering a premium to any person who will find a situation for the advertiser. Many persons have recently been duped in their search after employment by fellows who have obtained their money by means of false pretences, but few have gone the length to pretend to put the advertiser in possession of the place which he sought. Dignam was indicted on the 5th of April 1777 at the Guildhall, Westminster, for defrauding Mr. John Clark of the sum of £100 2 shillings and 10pence, which he had obtained from him under the pretence of investing him with the office of the Clerk of the Minutes in His Majesty's Custom House in Dublin. The evidence in the case was very simple. The negotiation was commenced between Mr. Clark and the prisoner at an early period in the year, and the money having been paid over, the prisoner handed to the prosecutor a stamped paper or warrant, bearing the signature of Lord Weymouth, and countersigned by Thomas Daw, which he told him would enable him to assume the office which it mentioned. Upon his proceeding to do so, however, he was found to have been hoaxed, and upon inquiry he discovered that the signatures were forged, and that the seals attached to the warrant had been taken from some other instrument. The jury immediately found the prisoner guilty, but the magistrates hesitated a long time on the punishment which should be inflicted on such an offender, and at length sentenced him to work 5 years on the River Thames. The prisoner, while in Tothill Fields, Bridewell, tried every means in his power to effect his escape, and offered to bribe an attendant in the prison with a banknote of £10 to favour his escape in a large chest. Upon his conviction, no time was now lost in conveying him on board the ballast lighter. Being possessed of plenty of money, and having high notions of gentility, he went to Woolwich in a post-chaise, with his negro servant behind, expecting that his money would procure every indulgence in his favour, and that his servant would still be admitted to attend him, but in this he was egregiously mistaken. The keepers of the lighter would not permit him to come on board, and Dignam was immediately put to the duty of the wheelbarrow. On Monday of the 5th of May, Dignam sent a forged draft for £500 for acceptance to Mr. Drummond, banker, at Charing Cross, who, discovering the imposition, carried the publishers before Sir John Fielding, but they were discharged, and it was intended to procure an habeas corpus to remove Dignam to London for examination. This plan, however, was soon seen through, for on consideration it seemed evident that Dignam, by sending the forged draft from on board the lighter, preferred the chance of escape, even though death presented itself on the other side, to his situation, so that no further steps were taken in the affair, and he remained at work for the period to which he was sentenced by the laws of his country. James Hill, alias Hind, alias Atkins, alias John the Painter. Executed for firing Portsmouth Dockyard. A more dangerous character than this has rarely existed. His offence was of a nature aimed at the very safety of the kingdom, and if successful, and followed up by the operations of his more powerful friends, for whose benefit it eventually appeared that he had committed the foul crime of which he was guilty, the most disastrous consequences might have ensued. Hill, it appears, was a Scotchman by birth, and was by trade a painter, from which circumstance he obtained the name by which he was generally known of John the Painter. Having gone to America at an early age, during a residence there of some years, he imbibed principles opposed to the interests of his own country. Transported with party zeal, he formed the desperate resolution of committing a most atrocious crime against the welfare of England, namely the burning of the dockyards at Portsmouth and Plymouth. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 7th of December 1776, a fire broke out in the roundhouse of Portsmouth Dock, by which the whole of that building was consumed, and from whose ravages the rest of the surrounding warehouses were with difficulty saved. The fire was at first attributed to accident, but on the 5th of January following, 3 men who were engaged in the hemp house discovered a tin machine, somewhat resembling a tea canister, and near the same spot a wooden box, containing various kinds of combustibles. This circumstance being communicated to the Commissioner of the Dock, and circulated among the public, several vague and indefinite suspicions fell upon Hill, who had been lurking about the dockyard, where he was distinguished by the appellation of John the Painter. In consequence of advertisements in the newspapers, offering a reward of £50 for apprehending him, he was secured at Odiham, and on the 17th of February the prisoner was examined at Sir John Fielding's office, Bow Street, where John Baldwin, who exercised the trade of a painter in different parts of America, attended by the direction of Lord Temple. The prisoner's conversations with Baldwin operated very materially to secure his conviction. He said he had taken a view of most of the dockyards and fortifications about England, the number of ships in the navy, and had observed their weight of metal and their number of men, and had been to France 2 or 3 times to inform Silas Deane, the American envoy, of his discoveries. That Deane gave him bills to the amount of £300, and letters of recommendation to a merchant in the city, which he had burned, lest they should lead to a discovery. He informed Baldwin further that he had instructed a tinman's apprentice at Canterbury to make him a tin canister, which he carried to Portsmouth, where he hired a lodging at one Mrs. Boxall's, and tried his preparations for setting fire to the dockyard. After recounting the manner of preparing matches and combustibles, he said that on the 6th of the preceding December he got into the hemp house, and having placed a candle in a wooden box and a tin canister over it, and sprinkled turpentine over some of the hemp, he proceeded to the rope house, where he placed a bottle of turpentine among the loose hemp, which he sprinkled also with turpentine, and, having laid matches, made of paper daubed over with powdered charcoal and gunpowder diluted with water, and other combustibles about the place, he returned to his lodgings. These matches were so contrived as to continue burning for 24 hours, so that by cutting them into proper lengths he might provide for his escape, knowing the precise time when the fire would reach the combustibles. He had hired lodgings in 2 other houses, to which he also intended to set fire, that the engines might not all be employed together in quenching the conflagration at the dock. On the 7th he again went to the hemp house, intending to set it on fire, but he was unable to effect his object, owing to a halfpennyworth of common house matches that he had brought not being sufficiently dry. This disappointment, he said, rendered him exceedingly uneasy, and he went from the hemp house to the rope house, and set fire to the matches he had placed there. His uneasiness was increased because he could not return to his lodging, where he had left a bundle containing an Ovid's Metamorphoses, a Treatise on War and Making Fireworks, a Justin, a pistol, and a French passport, in which his real name was inserted, and also because he could not fire them too in accordance with his original plan. When he had set fire to the rope house, he proceeded towards London, deeply regretting his failure in attempting to fire the other building, and was strongly inclined to discharge a pistol into the windows of the women who had sold him the bad matches. He jumped into a cart and gave the woman who drove it 6pence to induce her to drive quick, and when he had passed the sentinels he observed that the fire had made so rapid a progress that the elements seemed in a blaze. At about 10 o'clock the next morning he arrived at Kingston, and having remained there until dusk, at that time he proceeded on towards London in the stage. Soon after his arrival he went to the house of the gentleman on whom the bills had been drawn, but having related his story he was received with distrust, and therefore went away. On his reaching Hammersmith he wrote back to the merchant saying that he was going to Bristol, and he added that the handiworks he meant to perform there would soon be known to the public. Soon after his arrival in Bristol he set fire to several houses, which were all burning at one time, and the flames were not extinguished until the damage to the amount of £15,000 had been caused. He also set fire to some combustibles which he had placed among the oil barrels on the quay, but in this instance without the effect which he desired. His trial commenced on the 6th of March 1777 at Winchester Castle, when witnesses were produced from different parts of the country, who proved the whole of his confession to Baldwin to be true, and gave other evidence of his guilt. When called upon for his defence, he complained of the reports circulated to his prejudice, and observed that it was easy for such a man as Baldwin to feign the story he had told, and for a number of witnesses to be collected to give it support. He declared that God alone knew whether he was or was not the person who set fire to the dockyard, and begged it might be attended to how far Baldwin ought to be credited, that if he had art enough, by lies, to insinuate anything out of him, his giving it to the knowledge of others was a breach of confidence, and if he would speak falsely to deceive him, he might also impose upon a jury. The learned judge having delivered his charge to the jury, after a moment's consideration they returned a verdict of guilty. The sentence of death was immediately passed upon the prisoner, and he was ordered for execution on the 10th of March following, when he was hanged within sight of the ruins which he had occasioned. His body for several years hung in chains on Blockhouse Point, on the opposite side of the harbour to the town. To these particulars we shall add his confession. On the morning after his condemnation he informed the turnkey of his own accord that he felt an earnest desire to confess his crime, and to lay the history of his life before the public, and that by discovering the whole of his unaccountable plots and treasonable practices he might make some atonement to his injured country for the wrongs he had done it, of which he was now truly sensible. this request being made known to the Earl of Sandwich, then First Lord of the Admiralty, that nobleman directed Sir John Fielding to send down proper persons to take and attest his confession. He said that the diabolical scheme of setting fire to the dockyards and the shipping originated in his own wicked mind on the very breaking out of the rebellion in America, and he had no peace until he proceeded to put it in practice. The more he thought of it, the more practicable it appeared, and with this wicked intent he crossed the Atlantic. He had no sooner landed than he proceeded to take surveys of the different dockyards, and he then went to Paris and had several conferences with Silas Deane, the rebel minister to the court of France. Deane was astonished at Hill's proposals, which embraced the destruction of the English dockyards and the shipping, but finding the projector an enthusiast in the cause of America, and a man of daring spirit, he gradually listened to his schemes, and supplied him with money to enable him to carry them into execution, procured him a French passport, and gave him a letter of credit on a merchant in London. He then confirmed the evidence given against him, and in particular that of the witness Baldwin, and he added that had he been successful in his attempt upon Portsmouth and Plymouth dockyards, he should have been rewarded with a commission in the American Navy. Francis Mercier, alias Louis Debut, executed for murder. The case of this criminal was attended by circumstances of very great atrocity. The malefactor and his unfortunate victim were natives of France. The unfortunate Jacques Mondroit was a jeweller and watchmaker of Paris, and had made a journey to London in order to find a market for different articles of his manufacture. His stock consisted of curious and costly trinkets, worth, as was computed, a few £1,000s. He took lodgings in Princes Street, and engaged Mercier, who had resided some time in London, as his interpreter on a liberal gratuity, and treated him as a friend. It appeared that the ungrateful villain had long determined upon murdering his employer, in order to possess himself of the whole of his valuable property. To this diabolical end he gave orders for an instrument to be made of singular construction, which was a principal means of leading to his discovery as the murderer. It was shaped somewhat like an Indian tomahawk, and this instrument of death he concealed until an opportunity offered to effect his detestable purpose. One day his employer, Monsieur Mondroit, invited him to spend the evening. They played at cards, sang some French songs, and took a cheerful glass. But with that moderation peculiarly observable among Frenchmen, and a late hour having arrived, the kind heart of the host forbade his dismissing his friend without offering him a bed for the night. The offer was accepted after some hesitation, and both parties retired to rest. As soon as the neighbours were wrapped in sleep, Mercier took from the lining of his coat, where it had remained constantly concealed, the fatal weapon which had been prepared, and with it he struck his victim repeated blows on the head until he killed him. He then thrust the body into one of the trunks in which the owner had brought over his merchandise, and having ransacked and plundered the apartments, he locked the doors and made his escape. On the next day he had the hardihood to return to the house, and inquire whether Monsieur Mondroit had set off, pretending that he had proposed a journey into the country, and the people of the house, concluding that he had let himself out before they had risen, and that this accounted for their finding the street door on the latch, replied that he must have departed, giving that circumstance as a reason for such belief. This audacious farce was acted by the murderer for some days, during which time he frequently called to know whether his friend had returned. The family, however, beginning to entertain suspicions of some foul play, procured a ladder, entered the chamber window of their unfortunate lodger, and soon discovered the body crammed into the trunk, which was only 2 feet 4 inches long, already beginning to putrefy. There appeared on the head several deep wounds. A warrant was thereupon granted to apprehend Mercier, who was taken just as he was alighting from a post-chaise in which he had been jaunting with a woman of the town. In his lodgings and on his person were found 16 gold watches, some of great value, a great number of brilliant diamonds and other rings, a variety of gold trinkets, and 75 guineas. On his examination he confessed his guilt, which, added to the proof that the manufactured articles had been the property of Montroit, secured his conviction. He was subsequently tried at the Old Bailey, and a verdict of guilty being returned, he was sentenced to be hanged on the following Monday. He was carried to execution opposite the place where he committed the murder, and no man ever met death with more dread. He used every evasion to prolong the fatal hour, repeatedly craving time for his devotions, until the sheriff, perceiving his motive, gave the signal, and he was turned off on the 8th of December 1777, amid the execrations of the surrounding spectators. End of part 36. Part 37 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 37. John Holmes and Peter Williams, whipped for stealing dead bodies. These impious robbers were of a class now happily no longer in existence, thanks to the exertions of modern legislators, who have made such enactments as render the stealing dead bodies no longer profitable. The names by which such fellows were formerly known were resurrectionists and body snatchers, and so common, nay, so necessary was their trade for the purposes of science, that it was carried on without the smallest attempt at concealment. A monthly publication in March 1776 says, "The remains of more than 20 dead bodies were discovered in a shed in Tottenham Court Road, supposed to have been deposited there by traders to the surgeons, of whom there is one, it is said, in the borough, who makes an open profession of dealing in dead bodies, and is well known by the name of the Resurrectionist." It is notorious that when Hunter, the famous anatomist, was in full practice, he had a surgical theatre behind his house in Windmill Street, where he gave lectures to a very numerous class of pupils, demonstrating upon stolen subjects. To this place such numbers of dead bodies were brought during the winter season, that the mob rose several times, and were upon the point of pulling down his house. Numberless were the instances of dead bodies being seized on their way to the surgeons, and it was known that hackney coachmen for an extra fare, and porters with hampers, were often employed by the resurrection men to convey their plunder to its market. In more recent days the establishment of Brooks, which was carried on for a purpose exactly similar to that of Hunter, has been equally well known to be supplied in the same manner. But at the same time that such a trade must have been most disgusting, and its effect most harrowing to persons, the bodies of whose friends or relations may have been carried off to be placed under the knife of the anatomist, every excuse must be made for those by whom it was supported. The advancement of science was most desirable to be obtained, and most important for the existing generation, and where the law was deficient in providing the proper means of obtaining this great end, it became requisite that measures, unlawful in themselves, it must be owned, should be adopted to secure an object, the absolute necessity of which was universally admitted. Provisions have recently been made by Parliament, by which all body stealing has been effectually stopped. The bodies of unclaimed paupers and suicides are now submitted to the anatomist, and under the excellent arrangements of a superintendent officer who is appointed, all hospitals and schools are well supplied, the number of bodies at his disposal being generally more than adequate to meet the demand. It should be added that the remains are invariably buried with all that decorum and respect which would be observed in the interment of a body under other circumstances. But to proceed to the case now before us. Holmes, the principal offender, was gravedigger of St. George's, Bloomsbury. Williams was his assistant, and a woman named Esther Donaldson was charged as an accomplice. They were all indicted in December 1777 for stealing the body of Mrs. Jane Sainsbury, who departed this life on the 9th of October, then last past, and whose corpse had been interred in the burying ground of St. George's on the Monday following. They were detected before they could secure their booty, and the widower, however unpleasant, demanded to prosecute them. In order to secure their conviction, he had to undergo the painful task of viewing and identifying the remains of his wife. The gravedigger and his deputy were convicted on the fullest of evidence, and the acquittal of the woman was much regretted, as no doubt remained of her equal guilt. She was therefore released, but Holmes and Williams were sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment, and to be whipped twice on their bare backs from the end of Kingsgate Street, Holborn, to Dyot Street, St. Giles, a distance of half a mile. The sentence was duly carried out amidst crowds of well-satisfied and approving spectators. Dr. William Dodd, executed for forgery. Part 1. The character and the offence of this unfortunate divine are too well known to render it necessary that any introduction to the recital of the circumstances of his case should be attempted. Dr. Dodd was the eldest son of a clergyman, who held the vicarage of Bourne in the county of Lincoln, and was born at Bourne on the 29th of May 1729, and after finishing his school education was admitted a sizar of Clare Hall, Cambridge, in the year 1745, under the tuition of Mr. John Courtail, afterwards Archdeacon of Lewes. At the university he acquired the approbation of his superiors by his close attention to his studies, and at the close of the year 1749 he took his first degree of Bachelor of Arts with considerable reputation, his name being included in the list of wranglers. It was not only in his academical pursuits, however, that he was emulous of distinction. Having a pleasing manner, a genteel address, and a lively imagination, he was equally celebrated for his accomplishments and his learning. In particular, he was fond of the elegancies of dress, and became, as he ludicrously expressed it, a zealous votary of the god of dancing, to whose service he dedicated much of that time which he could borrow from his more important avocations. The talent which he possessed was very early displayed to the public, and by the time he had attained the age of 18 years, prompted by the desire of fame and perhaps also to increase his income, he commenced author, in which character he began to obtain some degree of reputation. At this period of his life, young, thoughtless, volatile, and inexperienced, he precipitately quitted the university, and relying entirely on his pen, removed to the metropolis, where he entered largely into the gaieties of the town, and followed every species of amusement with the most dangerous avidity. In this course, however, he did not continue long. To the surprise of his friends, who least suspected him of taking such a step without fortune, and destitute of all means of supporting a family, he hastily united himself on the 15th of April, 1751, in marriage with Miss Mary Perkins, daughter of one of the domestics of Sir John Dolben, a young lady then residing in Frith Street, Soho, who, though endowed with personal attractions, was deficient in those of birth and fortune. To a person circumstanced as Mr. Dodd then was, no measure could be more imprudent, or apparently more ruinous and destructive to his future prospects in life. He did not, however, seem to view it in that light, but, with a degree of thoughtlessness natural to him, he immediately took and furnished a house in Wardour Street. His friends now began to be alarmed at his situation, and his father came to town in great distress upon the occasion, and in consequence of the advice which he gave him, his son quitted his house before the commencement of winter, and urged by the same preceptor, he was induced to adopt a new plan for his future subsistence. On the 19th of October in the same year, he was ordained a deacon by the Bishop of Ely, at Caius College, Cambridge, and with more prudence than he had ever shown before, he now devoted himself with great assiduity to the study and duties of his profession. In these pursuits he appeared so sincere that he even renounced all his attention to his favourite objects, polite letters. At the end of his preface to the Beauties of Shakespeare, published in this year, he says, "For my own part, better and more important things henceforth demand my attention, and I here with no small pleasure take leave of Shakespeare and the critics. As this work was begun and finished before I entered upon the sacred function in which I am now happily employed, let me trust this juvenile performance will prove no objection, since graver and some very eminent members of the Church have thought it no improper employ to comment upon, explain, and publish the works of their own country poets." The first service in which he was engaged as a clergyman was to assist the Reverend Mr. Wyatt, vicar of West Ham, as his curate. Thither he removed, and there he spent the happiest and more honourable moments of his life. His behaviour was proper, decent, and exemplary. It acquired for him the respect and secured for him the favour of his parishioners so far, that on the death of their lecturer, in 1752, he was chosen to succeed him. His abilities had at this time every opportunity of being shown to advantage, and his exertions were so properly directed that he soon became a favourite and popular preacher. Those who were at this period of his life acquainted with his character and his talents bear testimony to the indefatigable zeal which he exhibited in his ministry, and the success with which his efforts were crowned. The follies of his youth seemed entirely past, and his friends viewed the alteration in his conduct with the greatest satisfaction, while the world promised itself an example to hold out for the imitation of others. At this early season of his life he entertained sentiments favourable towards the opinions of Mr. Hutchinson, and he was suspected to incline towards Methodism, but subsequent consideration confirmed his belief in the doctrines of the established Church. In 1752 he was selected lecturer of St. James, Garlick Hill, which 2 years afterwards he exchanged for the same post at St. Olave, Hart Street, and about the same time he was appointed to preach Lady Moyer's lectures at St. Paul's, where from the visit of the three angels to Abraham, and other similar passages in the Old Testament, he endeavoured to prove the commonly received doctrine of the Trinity. On the establishment of the Magdalen House in 1758, he was amongst the first and most active promoters of that excellent charitable institution, which derived great advantage from his zeal for its prosperity, and which, even up to the unhappy termination of his life, continued to be materially benefited by the exercise of his talents in its behalf. His exertions, however, were not confined to this hospital, but he was also one of the promoters of the Society for the Relief of Poor Debtors, and of the Humane Society for the recovery of persons apparently drowned. From the time that he entered upon the service of the Church, Dr. Dodd had resided at West Ham, and made up the deficiency in his income by superintending the education of a few young gentlemen who were placed under his care, an occupation for which he was well fitted. In 1759 he took the degree of Master of Arts, and in 1763 he was appointed Chaplain in Ordinary to the King, and about the same time he became acquainted with Dr. Squire, the Bishop of St. David's, who received him into his patronage, presented him to the Prebend of Brecon, and recommended him to the Earl of Chesterfield as a proper person to be entrusted with the tuition of his successor in the title. The following year saw him chaplain to the King, and in 1766 he took the degree of Doctor of Laws at Cambridge. The expectations which he had long entertained of succeeding to the rectory of West Ham now appeared hopeless, and having given up all prospect of their being realised, after having been twice disappointed, he resigned his lectureship, both there and in the city, and quitted the place. "A place," said he to Lord Chesterfield, in a dedication to a sermon entitled "Popery Inconsistent with the Natural Rights of Men in General, and Englishmen in Particular," published in 1768, "ever dear and ever regretted by me, the loss of which truly affecting to my mind, for there I was useful, and there I trust I was loved, nothing but your Lordship's friendship and connection could have counterbalanced." The Thoughts in Prison of the unfortunate gentleman contain a passage of a similar tendency, from which it may be inferred that he was compelled to quit his favourite residence, a circumstance which he pathetically laments, and probably with great reason, as the first step to that change in his situation which led him insensibly to his last fatal catastrophe. On his quitting West Ham he removed to a house in Southampton Row, and at the same time he launched out into scenes of expense, which his income, although now by no means a small one, was inadequate to support. He provided himself with a country house at Ealing, and exchanged his chariot for a coach, in order to accommodate his pupils, who, besides his noble charge, were in general persons of family and fortune. About the same time it was his misfortune to obtain a prize of £1,000 in the State Lottery, and elated with his success, he engaged with a builder in a plan to erect a chapel near the palace of the Queen, from whom it took its name. He entered also into a like partnership at Charlotte's Chapel, Bloomsbury, and both these schemes were for some time very beneficial to him, though their proceeds were much inferior to his expensive habits of living. His expectations from the former of these undertakings were extremely sanguine. It is reported that in fitting up his chapel near the palace, he flattered himself with the hopes of having some young royal auditors, and in that expectation assigned a particular pew or gallery for the heir apparent. But in this, as in many other of his views, he was disappointed. In the year 1772 he obtained the rectory of Hockliffe in Bedfordshire, the first cure of souls he ever had. With this also he held the vicarage of Chalgrove, and the two were soon after consolidated. An accident happened about this time, from which he narrowly escaped with his life. Returning from Barnet, he was stopped near St. Pancras by a highwayman, who discharged a pistol into the carriage, which happily only broke the glass. For this fact the delinquent was tried, and on Mrs. Dodd's evidence convicted and hanged. Early in the next year Lord Chesterfield died, and was succeeded by Dr. Dodd's pupil, who appointed his preceptor to be his chaplain. At this period Dr. Dodd appears to have been in the zenith of his popularity and reputation. Beloved and respected by all orders of people, he would have reached, in all probability, the situation which was the object of his wishes, had he possessed patience enough to have waited for it, and prudence sufficient to keep him himself out of those difficulties which might prove fatal to his integrity. But the habits of dissipation and expense had acquired too great an influence over him, and he had by their means involved himself in considerable debts. To extricate himself from them, he was tempted to an act which entirely cut off every hope which he could entertain of rising in his profession, and totally ruined him in the opinion of the world. On the translation of Bishop Moss in February 1774 to the see of Bath and Wells, the valuable rectory of St. George, Hanover Square, fell to the disposal of the Crown, by virtue of the King's prerogative. Whether from the suggestion of his own mind, or from the persuasion of some friend, is uncertain, but on this occasion he took a step of all others the most wild and extravagant, and the least likely to be attended with success. he caused an anonymous letter to be sent to Lady Apsley, offering the sum of £3,000 if, by her means, he could be presented to the living. The letter was immediately communicated to the Chancellor, and, after being traced to the writer, was laid before his Majesty. The insult offered to so high an officer by the proposal was followed by instant punishment. Dr. Dodd's name was ordered to be struck out of the list of chaplains. The press teemed with satire and invective. He was abused and ridiculed in the papers of the day, and, to crown the whole, the transaction became the subject of entertainment in one of Mr. Foot's pieces at the Haymarket. As no explanation could justify so absurd a measure, so no apology could palliate it. An evasive letter in the newspapers, promising a justification at a future day, was treated with universal contempt, and, stung with remorse and feeling alive to the disgrace he had brought on himself, he hastily quitted the place where neglect and insult only attended him, and, going to Geneva to his late pupil, he was presented by him with the living of Wing in Buckinghamshire, which he held with that of Hockliffe by virtue of a dispensation. Though encumbered with debts, he might still have retrieved his circumstances, if not his character, had he attended to the dictates of prudence, but his extravagance continued undiminished, and drove him to pursue schemes which overwhelmed him with additional infamy. He became the editor of a newspaper, and it is said that he even attempted, by means of a commission of bankruptcy, to clear himself from his debts, an attempt in which, however, he failed. From this period it would appear that every step which he took led to complete his ruin. In the summer of 1776 he went to France, and there, with little regard to decency or the observances proper to be maintained by a minister of religion, he paraded himself in a phaeton at the races on the plains of Sablon, dressed in all the foppery of the kingdom in which he was temporarily resident. At the beginning of winter he returned to London, and continued there to exercise the duties of his profession, until the very moment of his committing the offence, for which his life was subsequently forfeited to the offended laws of his country. On the 2nd of February, 1777, he preached his last sermon at the Magdalen Chapel, where he was still heard with approbation and pleasure, and on the 4th of the same month he forged a bond, purporting to be that of his late pupil, the Earl of Chesterfield, for £4,200. Pressed by creditors, and unable any longer to meet their demands or soothe their importunities, he was driven to commit this crime, as the only expedient to which he could have recourse to aid him in his escape from his difficulties. The method which he adopted in completing the forgery was very remarkable. He pretended that the noble Earl had urgent occasion to borrow £4,000, but that he did not choose to be his own agent, and he begged that the matter therefore might be secretly and expeditiously conducted. A person named Lewis Robertson was the person whom he employed as broker to negotiate the transaction, and he presented to him a bond, not filled up or signed, that he might find a person ready to advance the sum required, as he directed him to say, to a young nobleman who had lately come of age. Several applications were made by Robertson without success, the persons refusing because they were not to be present when the bond was executed, but at length the agent, confiding in the honour and integrity of his employer, went to Messrs. Fletcher and Peach, who agreed to advance the money. Mr. Robertson then carried the bond back to the doctor, in order that it might be filled up and executed, and on the following day it was returned, bearing the signature of the Earl of Chesterfield, and attested by the doctor himself. Mr. Robertson, knowing that Mr. Fletcher was a man who required all legal observances to be attended to, and that he would therefore object to the bond as bearing the name of one witness only, put his name under that of Dr. Dodd, and in that state he carried the bond to him, and received from him the sum of £4,000 in return, which he paid over to his employer. The bond was subsequently produced to the Earl of Chesterfield, but immediately on his seeing it he disowned it, and expressed himself at a loss to know by whom such a forgery upon him could have been committed. It was evident, however, that the supposed attesting witnesses must, if their signatures were genuine, be acquainted with its author, and Mr. Manley, his lordship's agent, went directly to consult Mr. Fletcher upon the best course to be taken, and after some deliberation Mr. Fletcher and Mr. Innes and Mr. Manley proceeded to Guildhall to prefer an information with regard to the forgery against Dr. Dodd and Mr. Robertson. Mr. Robertson was without difficulty secured, and then Fletcher, Innes, and Manley, accompanied by 2 of the Lord Mayor's officers, went to the house of the doctor in Argyle Street, whither he had recently removed. Upon their explaining the nature of their business to him, he appeared much struck and affected, and declared his willingness to make any reparation in his power. Mr. Manley told him that his instantly returning the money was the only mode which remained for him to save himself, and he immediately gave up 6 notes of £500 each, making £3000, and he drew on his banker for 500 more. The broker then returned £100, and the doctor gave a second draft on his banker for £200, and a judgment on his goods for the remaining £400. All this was done by the doctor in full reliance on the honour of the parties that the bond should be returned to him cancelled, but notwithstanding this restitution, he was taken before the Lord Mayor and charged with the forgery. The doctor declared that he had no intention to defraud Lord Chesterfield, or the gentleman who advanced the money, and hoped that the satisfaction he had made in returning it would atone for his offence. He was pressed, he said, exceedingly for £300 to pay some bills due to tradesmen, and took this step as a temporary resource, and would have repaid the money in half a year. My Lord Chesterfield, added he, cannot but have some tenderness for me as my pupil. I love him, and he knows it. There is nobody wishes to prosecute. I am sure my Lord Chesterfield don't want my life. I hope he will show clemency to me. Mercy should triumph over justice. Clemency, however, was denied, and the doctor was committed to the Compter in preparation for his trial. On the 19th of February, Dr. Dodd, being put to the bar at the Old Bailey, addressed the court in the following words: My Lords, I am informed that the bill of indictment against me has been found on the evidence of Mr. Robertson, who was taken out of Newgate without any authority or leave from your lordships for the purpose of procuring the bill to be found. Mr. Robertson is a subscribing witness to the bond, and, as I conceive, would be swearing to exculpate himself if he should be admitted as a witness against me, and as the bill has been found upon his evidence which was surreptitiously obtained, I submit to your lordships that I ought not to be compelled to plead on this indictment, and upon this question I beg to be heard by my counsel. I beg leave also further to observe to your lordships that the gentlemen on the other side of the question are bound over to prosecute Mr. Robertson. Previously to the arguments of the counsel, an order which had been surreptitiously obtained from an officer of the court, dated Wednesday, February 19th, and directed to the keeper of Newgate, commanding him to carry Lewis Robertson to Hicks Hall, in order to his giving evidence before the Grand Inquest on the present bill of indictment, as well as a resolution of the court reprobating the said order, and also the recognizance entered into by Mr. Manley, Mr. Peach, Mr. Innes, and the Right Honourable the Earl of Chesterfield to prosecute and give evidence against Dr. Dodd and Lewis Robertson for forgery, were ordered to be read, and the clerk of the arraigns was directed to inform the court whether the name Lewis Robertson was endorsed as a witness on the back of the indictment, which was answered in the affirmative. The counsel now proceeded in their arguments for and against the prisoner. Mr. Howarth, one of Dr. Dodd's advocates, contended that no person ought to plead or answer to an indictment if it appeared upon the face of that indictment that the evidence upon which the bill was found was not legal, or competent to have been adduced before the grand jury. Mr. Cooper and Mr. Buller, on the same side, pursued the same line of argument with equal ingenuity, and expressed a hope that Dr. Dodd would not be called upon to plead to an indictment found upon such evidence as had been pointed out, but that the indictment would be ordered to be quashed. The counsel for the prosecution advanced various arguments in opposition to those employed on the other side, and the learned judge having taken a note of the objection, it was agreed that the trial should proceed, the question of the competency of Mr. Robertson as a witness being reserved for the consideration of the 12 judges. End of Part 37. Part 38 of the Chronicles of Crime, Volume 1, by Camden Pelham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 38. Dr. William Dodd, executed for forgery. Part 2. The doctor was then arraigned upon the indictment, which charged him in the usual terms with the forgery upon the Earl of Chesterfield, and the evidence in proof of the facts above stated having been given, the court called upon the prisoner for his defence. He addressed the court and jury in the following terms: My lords and gentlemen of the jury, upon the evidence which has this day been produced against me, I find it very difficult to address your lordships. There is no man in the world who has a deeper sense of the heinous nature of the crime for which I stand indicted than myself. I view it, my lords, in all its extent of malignancy towards a commercial state like ours, but, my lords, I humbly apprehend, though no lawyer, that the moral turpitude and malignancy of the crime always, both in the eye of the law and of religion, consists in the intention. I am informed, my lord, that the Act of Parliament on this head runs perpetually in this style, with an intention to defraud. Such an intention, my lords and gentlemen of the jury, I believe has not been attempted to be proved upon me, and the consequences that have happened, which have appeared before you, sufficiently prove that a perfect and ample restitution has been made. I leave it, my lords, to you and the gentlemen of the jury, to consider that if an unhappy man ever deviates from the law of right, yet if in the single first moment of recollection he does all that he can to make a full and perfect amends, what, my lord and gentlemen of the jury, can God and man desire further? My lords, there are a variety of little circumstances too tedious to trouble you with respect to this matter. Were I to give loose to my feelings, I have many things to say which I am sure you would feel with respect to me, but as it appears on all hands that no injury, intentional or real, has been done to any man living, I hope that you will consider the case in its true state of clemency. I must observe to your lordships that though I have met with all candour in this court, yet I have been pursued with excessive cruelty. I have been prosecuted after the most express engagements, after the most solemn assurances, after the most delusive, soothing arguments of Mr. Manley. I have been prosecuted with a cruelty scarcely to be paralleled. A person avowedly criminal, in the same indictment with myself, has been brought forth as a capital witness against me, a fact, I believe, totally unexampled. My lord, oppressed as I am with infamy, loaded as I am with distress, sunk under this cruel prosecution, your lordships and the gentlemen of the jury cannot think a life a matter of any value to me. No, my lords, I solemnly protest that death of all blessings would be the most pleasant to me after this pain. I have yet, my lords, ties which call upon me, ties which render me desirous even to continue this miserable existence. I have a wife, my lords, who for 27 years has lived an unparalleled example of conjugal attachment and fidelity, and whose behaviour during this trying scene would draw tears of approbation, I am sure, even from the most inhuman. My lords, I have creditors, honest men, who will lose much by my death. I hope, for the sake of justice towards them, some mercy will be shown to me. If, upon the whole, these considerations at all avail with you, if upon the most impartial survey of matters not the slightest intention of injury can appear to any one, and I solemnly declare it was in my power to replace it in 3 months. Of this I assured Mr. Robertson frequently, and had his solemn assurances that no man should be privy to it but Mr. Fletcher and himself, and if no injury was done to any man upon earth, I then hope, I trust, I fully confide myself in the tenderness, humanity, and protection of my country. The jury retired for about 10 minutes, then returned with the verdict that the prisoner was guilty, but at the same time presented a petition humbly recommending the doctor to the royal mercy. It was afterwards declared that upon the reserved point the opinion of the judges was that he had been legally convicted. On the last day of the sessions Dr. Dodd was again put to the bar to receive judgment. The clerk of the arraigns then addressed him, saying, "Dr. William Dodd, you stand convicted of forgery. What have you to say why this court should not give you judgment to die according to law?" In reply, Dr. Dodd addressed the court as follows: "My lord, I now stand before you a dreadful example of human infirmity. I entered upon public life with the expectations common to young men whose education has been liberal and whose abilities have been flattered, and when I became a clergyman I considered myself as not impairing the dignity of the order. I was not an idle, nor I hope a useless minister. I taught the truths of Christianity with the zeal of conviction and the authority of innocence. My labours were approved, my pulpit became popular, and I have reason to believe that, of those who heard me, some have been preserved from sin, and some have been reclaimed. Condescend, my lord, to think, if these considerations aggravate my crime, how much they must embitter my punishment. Being distinguished and elevated by the confidence of mankind, I had too much confidence in myself, and thinking my integrity, what others thought it, established in sincerity and fortified by religion, I did not consider the danger of vanity, nor suspect the deceitfulness of mine own heart. The day of conflict came, in which temptation seized and overwhelmed me. I committed the crime which I entreat your lordship to believe that my conscience hourly represents to me in its full bulk of mischief and malignity. Many have been overpowered by temptation, who are now among the penitent in heaven. To an act now waiting the decision of vindictive justice, I will now presume to oppose the counterbalance of almost 30 years, a great part of the life of man, passed in exciting and exercising charity, in relieving such distress as I now feel, in administering those consolations which I now want. I will not otherwise extenuate my offence than by declaring, what I hope will appear to many, and what many circumstances make probable, that I did not intend finally to defraud, nor will it become me to apportion my own punishment by alleging that my sufferings have been not much less than my guilt. I have fallen from reputation which ought to have made me cautious, and from a fortune which ought to have given me content. I am sunk at once into poverty and scorn. My name and my crime fill the ballads in the streets, the sport of the thoughtless, and the triumph of the wicked. It may seem strange, my lord, that remembering what I have lately been, I should still wish to continue what I am. But contempt of death, how speciously soever it may mingle with heathen virtues, has nothing in it suitable to Christian penitence. Many motives impel me to beg earnestly for life. I feel the natural horror of a violent death, the universal dread of untimely dissolution. I am desirous to recompense the injury I have done to the clergy, to the world, and to religion, and to efface the scandal of my crime by the example of my repentance, but above all I wish to die with the thoughts more composed and calmer preparation. The gloom and confusion of a prison, the anxiety of a trial, the horrors of suspense, and the inevitable vicissitudes of passion, leave not the mind in a due disposition for the holy exercises of prayer and self-examination. let not a little life be denied me, in which I may, by meditation and contrition, prepare myself to stand at the tribunal of omnipotence, and support the presence of that Judge who shall distribute to all according to their works, who will receive and pardon the repenting sinner, and from whom the merciful shall obtain mercy. For these reasons, my lords, amidst shame and misery, I yet wish to live, and most humbly implore that I may be recommended by your lordships to the clemency of his Majesty." Here he sunk down overcome with mental agony, and some time elapsed before he was sufficiently recovered to hear the dreadful sentence of the law which the Recorder pronounced upon him in the following words: "Dr. William Dodd, you have been convicted of the offence of publishing a forged and counterfeit bond, knowing it to be forged and counterfeited, and you have the advantage which the laws of this country afford to every man in your situation, a fair, an impartial, and an attentive trial. The jury to whose justice you appealed have found you guilty. Their verdict has undergone the consideration of the learned judges, and they found no ground to impeach the justice of that verdict. You yourself have admitted the justice of it, and now the very painful duty that the necessity of the law imposes upon the court to pronounce the sentence of that law against you remains only to be performed. You appear to entertain a very proper sense of the enormity of the offence which you have committed. You appear, too, in a state of contrition of mind, and I doubt not have duly reflected how far the dangerous tendency of the offence you have been guilty of is increased by the influence of example, in being committed by a person of your character, and of the sacred function of which you are a member. These sentiments seem to be yours. I would wish to cultivate such sentiments, but I would not wish to add to the anguish of your mind by dwelling upon your situation. Your application for mercy must be made elsewhere. It would be cruel in the court to flatter you. There is a power of dispensing mercy where you may apply. Your own good sense and the contrition you express will induce you to lessen the influence of the example by publishing your hearty and sincere detestation of the offence of which you are convicted, and will show you that to attempt to palliate or extenuate it would indeed add to the influence of a crime of this kind being committed by a person of your character and known abilities. I would therefore warn you against anything of that kind. Now, having said this, I am obliged to pronounce the sentence of the law, which is, that you, Dr. William Dodd, will be carried from hence to the place from whence you came, that from thence you be carried to the place of execution, and that there you be hanged by the neck until you are dead." To this Dr. Dodd replied, "Lord Jesus, receive my soul," and was immediately conveyed from the bar. Great exertions were now made to save Dr. Dodd. The newspapers were filled with letters and paragraphs in his favour. Individuals of all ranks exerted themselves in his behalf. The members of several charities which had been benefited by him joined in application to the throne for mercy. Parish officers went in mourning from house to house to procure subscriptions to a petition to the king, and this petition, which, with the names of nearly 30,000 persons, filled 23 sheets of parchment, was actually presented. Even the Lord Mayor and Common Council went in a body to St. James's to solicit mercy for the convict. These were, however, of no avail. On the 15th of June the Privy Council assembled, and deliberated on the cases of the several prisoners then under condemnation, and in the end a warrant was ordered to be made out for the execution of Dr. Dodd, with 2 others, one of whom was afterwards reprieved, on the 27th of the same month. Having been flattered with hopes of a pardon, he appeared to be much shocked at the intimation of his approaching destiny, but resumed in a short time a degree of fortitude sufficient to enable him to pass through the last scene of his life with firmness and decency. On the 26th he took leave of his wife and some friends, and he afterwards declared himself ready to atone for the offence he had given to the world. His deportment was meek, humble, and devout, expressive of resignation and contrition, and calculated to inspire sentiments of respect for his person, and concern for his unhappy fate. He was attended to the fatal spot in a mourning coach by the Reverend Mr. Villette, Ordinary of Newgate, and the Reverend Mr. Doby. Another criminal named John Harris was executed at the same time. It is impossible to give an idea of the immense crowds of people that thronged the streets from Newgate to Tyburn. When the prisoners arrived at the fatal tree and were placed in the cart, Dr. Dodd exhorted his fellow sufferer in so generous a manner as testified that he had not forgotten his duty as a clergyman, and he was also very fervent in the exercise of his own devotions. Just before he was turned off, he was observed to whisper to the executioner, and although we have not the means of ascertaining the precise purport of this remark, it is pretty obvious from the fact that as soon as the cart had been drawn away from the gibbet, he ran immediately under the scaffold and took hold of the doctor's legs as if to steady his body, and the unfortunate gentleman appeared to die without pain. Of his behaviour before the execution a particular account was given by Mr. Villette, Ordinary of Newgate, in the following terms. On the morning of his death I went to him, with the Reverend Mr. Doby, chaplain of the Magdalen, whom he desired to attend him in the place of execution. He appeared composed, and when I asked him how he had been supported, he said he had had some comfortable sleep, by which he should be better enabled to perform his duty. As we went from his room, in our way to the chapel, we were joined by his friend who had spent the foregoing evening with him, and also by another clergyman. When we were in the vestry adjoining the chapel, he exhorted his fellow sufferer, who had attempted to destroy himself but had been prevented by the vigilance of the keeper. He spoke to him with great tenderness and emotion of heart, entreating him to consider that he had but a short time to live, and that it was highly necessary that he, as well as himself, made good use of their time, implored pardon of God under a deep sense of sin, and looked to that Lord by whose merits alone sinners can be saved. He desired me to call in the other gentleman, who likewise assisted him to move the heart of the poor youth, but the doctor's words were the most pathetic and effectual. He lifted up his hands and cried, "O Lord Jesus, have mercy upon us, and give unto him, my fellow sinner, that, as we suffer together, we may go together to heaven." His conversation to this poor youth was so moving that tears flowed from the eyes of all present. When we went into the chapel to prayer and the Holy Communion, true contrition and warmth of devotion appeared evident in him throughout the whole service. After it was ended, he again addressed himself to Harris in the most moving and persuasive manner, and not without effect, for he declared that he was glad that he had not made away with himself, and said he was easier, and hoped he would now go to heaven. The doctor told him how Christ had suffered for them, and that he himself was a greater sinner than he, as he had sinned more against light and conviction, and therefore his guilt was greater, and that, as he was confident that mercy was shown to his soul, so he should look to Christ and trust in his merits. He prayed to God to bless his friends who were present with him, and to give his blessing to all his brethren the clergy, that he would pour out his Spirit upon them, and make them true ministers of Jesus Christ, that they might follow the divine precepts of their heavenly Master. Turning to one who stood near him, he stretched out his hand and said, "Now, my dear friend, speculation is at an end. All must be real. What poor ignorant beings we are." He prayed for the Magdalens, and wished they were there to sing for him the 23rd Psalm. After he had waited for some time for the officers, he asked what o'clock it was, and being told that it was half an hour after 8, he said, "I wish they were ready, for I long to be gone." He requested of his friends, who were in tears about him, to pray for him, to which he was answered by two of them, "We pray more than language can utter." He replied, "I believe it." At length he was summoned to go down into a part of the yard which is enclosed from the rest of the jail, where the two unhappy convicts and the friends of the doctor were alone. On his seeing two prisoners looking out of the windows, he went to them and exhorted them so pathetically that they both wept abundantly. He said once, "I am now a spectacle to men, and shall soon be a spectacle to angels." Just before the sheriff's officers came with the halters, one who was walking with him told him that there was yet a little ceremony he must pass through before he went out. He asked, "What is that?" "You will be bound." He looked up and said, "Yet I am free. My freedom is there," pointing upwards. He bore it with Christian patience, and beyond what might have been expected, and when the men offered to excuse tying his hands, he desired them to do their duty and thanked them for their kindness. After he was bound, I offered to assist him with my arm in conducting him through the yard, where several people were assembled to see him, but he replied with seeming pleasure, "No, I am as firm as a rock." As he passed along the yard, the spectators and prisoners wept and bemoaned him, and he in return prayed God to bless them. On the way to the execution he consoled himself in reflecting and speaking on what Christ had suffered for him, lamented the depravity of human nature, which made sanguinary laws necessary, and said he could gladly have died in the prison yard, as being led out to public execution tended greatly to distress him. He desired me to read to him the 51st Psalm, and also pointed out an admirable penitential prayer from Rozel's Prisoner's Director. He prayed again for the king, and likewise for the people. When he came near the streets where he formerly dwelt, he was much affected and wept. He said probably his tears would seem to be the effect of cowardice, but it was a weakness he could not well help, and added he hoped he was going to a better home. When he arrived at the gallows, he ascended the cart and spoke to his fellow sufferer. He then prayed, not only for himself, but also for his wife and the unfortunate youth that suffered with him, and declaring that he died in the true faith of the gospel of Christ, in perfect love and charity with all mankind, and with thankfulness to his friends, he was launched into eternity, imploring mercy for his soul, for the sake of the blessed Redeemer. A paper, of which the following is a copy, had been delivered by Dr. Dodd to Mr. Villette to be read at the place of execution, but it was omitted, as it seemed impossible to make all present aware of its contents. To the words of dying men, regard has always been paid. I am brought hither to suffer death for an act of fraud, of which I confess myself guilty with shame, such as my former state of life naturally produces, and I hope with such sorrow as he, to whom the heart is known, will not disregard. I repent that I have violated the laws by which peace and confidence are established among men. I repent that I have attempted to injure my fellow creatures, and I repent that I have brought disgrace upon my order, and discredit upon religion. But my offences against God are without number, and can admit only of general confession and general repentance. Grant, Almighty God, for the sake of Jesus Christ, that my repentance, however late, however imperfect, may not be in vain. The little good that now remains in my power is to warn others against those temptations by which I have been seduced. I have always sinned against conviction. My principles have never been shaken. I have always considered the Christian religion as a revelation from God, and its divine author as the Saviour of the world, but the laws of God, though never disowned by me, have often been forgotten. I was led astray from religious strictness by the delusion of show and the delights of voluptuousness. I never knew or attended to the calls of frugality, or the needful minuteness of painful economy. Vanity and pleasure, into which I plunged, required expense disproportionate to my income. Expense brought distress upon me, and distress, importunate distress, urged me to temporary fraud. For this fraud I am to die, and I die declaring in the most solemn manner that, however I have deviated from my own precepts, I have taught others, to the best of my knowledge, and with all sincerity, the true way to eternal happiness. My life, for some few unhappy years past, has been dreadfully erroneous, but my ministry has always been sincere. I have constantly believed, and I now leave the world solemnly avowing my conviction that there is no other name under heaven by which we can be saved, but only the name of the Lord Jesus, and I entreat all who are here to join with me in my last petition, that for the sake of that Lord Jesus Christ my sins may be forgiven, and my soul received into his everlasting kingdom. William Dodd, June 27th, 1777. The body of the doctor was on the Monday morning following carried to Cowley in Buckinghamshire and deposited in the church there. During the doctor's confinement in Newgate, a period of several months, he chiefly employed himself in writing various pieces, which show at once his piety and talent. The principal of these were his Thoughts in Prison, in 5 parts, from which we cannot doubt, in finishing our life of so eminent, yet unfortunate a man, will be gratified by the insertion of a few short extracts. I began these thoughts, says the unhappy man, writing in Newgate under the date of 23rd of April 1777, after his condemnation, merely from the impression in my mind, without plan, purpose, or motive, more than the situation of my soul. I continued thence on a thoughtful and regular plan, and I have been enabled wonderfully, in a state which in better days I should have supposed would have destroyed all power of reflection, to bring them nearly to a conclusion. I dedicate them to God and the reflecting serious among my fellow creatures, and I bless the Almighty for the ability to go through them amidst the terrors of this dire place, Newgate, and the bitter anguish of my disconsolate mind. The thinking will easily pardon all inaccuracies, as I am neither able nor willing to read over these melancholy lines with a curious or critical eye. They are imperfect, but in the language of the heart, and, had I time and inclination, might and should be improved, but... Signed, W.D. The unfortunate author's thoughts on his imprisonment are thus introduced. My friends are gone, harsh on its sullen hinge grates the dread door, the massy bolts respond, tremendous to the surly keeper's touch, the dire keys clang with movements dull and slow, while their behest the ponderous locks perform, and fastened firm the object of their care is left to solitude, to sorrow left. But wherefore fastened, O still stronger bonds than bolts or locks or doors or molten brass, to solitude and sorrow could consign his anguished soul, and prison him though free. For whither should he fly, or where produce in open day, and to the golden sun his hapless head, whence every laurel torn on his bald brow sits grinning infamy, and all in sportive triumph twines around the keen, the stinging arrows of disgrace. After dwelling on the miseries of that dreary confinement, at sight of which he formerly started back with horror, he adds, O dismal change! Now not in friendly sort a Christian visitor, to pour the balm of Christian comfort in some wretch's ear. I am that wretch myself, and much want that Christian consolation I bestowed, so cheerfully bestowed, want, my God, from thee the mercy, which thou know'st my gladsome soul ever sprang forth with transport to impart. Why then, mysterious Providence, pursued with such unfeeling ardour, why pursued to death's dread borne by men to me unknown? Why, stop the deep question, it o'erwhelms my soul, it reels, it staggers, earth turns round, my brain whirls in confusion, my impetuous heart throbs with pulsation not to be restrained. Why, where, O Chesterfield, my son, my son? The unfortunate divine afterwards thus proceeds: Nay, talk not of composure. I had thought in older time that my weak heart was soft, and pity's self might break it. I had thought that marble-eyed severity would crack the slender nerves which guide my reins of sense, and give me up to madness. 'Tis not so. My heart is callous, and my nerves are tough. It will not break, they will not crack, or else what more? Just heaven was wanting to the deed than to behold. Oh, that eternal night had in that moment screened from myself my stanhope to behold. Ah, piercing sight, forget it, 'tis distraction, speak who can. But I am lost, a criminal adjudged. It is not a little singular that Dr. Dodd, a few years before his death, published a sermon entitled "The Frequency of Capital Punishments Inconsistent with Justice, Sound Policy and Religion." This, he says, was intended to have been preached in the Chapel Royal at St. James's, but omitted on account of the absence of the court during the author's month of waiting. The following extract will show the unfortunate man's opinion on this subject, although there is no reason to suppose that he then contemplated the commission of the crime for which he suffered. He says, "It would be easy to show the injustice of those laws which demand blood for the slightest offences, the superior justice and propriety of inflicting perpetual and laborious servitude, the greater utility hereof to the sufferer, as well as to the state, especially wherein we have a variety of necessary occupations, particularly noxious and prejudicial to the lives of the honest and industrious, and in which they might be employed who had forfeited their lives and their liberties to society." End of part 38.